On December the 7th, 1941, as World War II raged, the focus of attention was snatched from the battlefields of Europe and diverted to the smoke and flames rising from the American Naval Base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. The empire of the rising sun had finally struck, piercing the heart of the US Navy in a bid to ensure that their plans for an Asian empire every bit as ambitious as Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich were not threatened. But as the injured were rushed to safety and America reeled from the shock of the Japanese attack, those battling against Hitler, most notably Winston Churchill and the people of Great Britain, were able to find some comfort in the tragedy, because America's president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, could now justify bringing the United States into the war. The story of Pearl Harbor may have been told many times, but it's nonetheless always fascinating, and in this program we will have the opportunity to revisit the events of that monumentous day as they unfolded, from the bombing of the USS Panay to the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, while discovering the reasons why the Japanese fleets traveled far across the ocean to pick a fight with World War II's sleeping giant. To begin at the beginning, it's necessary to appreciate that America and Japan were two nations that had developed in very different worlds, both geographically and culturally. As a chain of islands in the East Pacific, Japan had lived in the shadow of the giant kingdom of China for many centuries, and the Japanese tradition of the ancient samurai was deeply ingrained in the warrior-like people. They were taught that honor was more sacred than life itself, as other nations that attempted to invade Japan quickly discovered. By the 17th century, Western traders and missionaries were venturing closer to the kingdoms of the Far East, but the Japanese, who were suspicious of their motives, closed their ports, and it became a very dangerous place for those who dared to step ashore. Far across the Pacific Ocean in the Americas, northern European pilgrims were settling with more success. By July the 4th of 1776, the United States claimed its independence from the United Kingdom after the American colonists refused to be governed by the British. However, tucked away in their hermit kingdom, the Japanese were blissfully unaware of the unrest in the Americas, and that the nation that would prove to be their most deadly enemy had fought its way into existence. It was a new age, and as time moved on, the great industries of the Western world developed, and by the 19th century there were ships traveling to the Far East in search of wealth that carried heavy armaments to protect their interests, and even a hermit kingdom like Japan was under threat. Soon it was clear that despite their warrior traditions, the Japanese would not be able to repel the encroaching ships forever. In 1854, a great fleet loomed on the horizon, led by the American Commodore, Admiral Matthew Perry. Tales of his victories in the Mexican-American War had spread as far as Japan, and the nation knew that this time they would have no choice but to open their ports. Within 4 years, the Americans had secured treaties to guarantee trade with Japan, and the Netherlands, Russia, Britain, and France swiftly followed with their own agreements for trading rights. The Japanese came to know them as the shameful, unequal treaties. While Japan started to trade with the merchants of the West, America began a period of expansion, following the example of the British and French. First came the purchase of the vast land of Alaska from the Russian Empire, with its endless forests and streams glittering with gold. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, it won Spanish land in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands and Guam, along with Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. The same year, America annexed the archipelago of Hawaii, which had first been explored by Captain Cook over 100 years earlier. As well as such treasures as sugarcane and pineapples, there was a natural harbor teeming with pearl-producing oysters. Recognizing its potential, the Americans soon created a naval base from where they could comfortably reach their new territory in the Pacific. While the United States enjoyed the fruits of its expansion, Japan, influenced by the industrial development of the West, began to take giant strides in improving its military prowess. It called on advisors from abroad to develop its army, which it began modelling on French battalions, and later the Prussian army, which had become the most dominant force in Europe. The naval fleet, on the other hand, was based on the British Royal Navy, and by the turn of the century would impress the world when it defeated the mighty Russians at sea. In 1904, the kingdom of the Russian Tsar was venturing dangerously close to Korea, the country Japan regarded as their safety buffer. In a magnificent assault, Admiral Togo led his naval forces into a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in northeastern China. 18 months later, Japan celebrated their victory, and Togo would go down in history as the Nelson of the East, to be forever worshipped by Japanese naval officers. By the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British called on Japan's naval power to aid the nations of the Entente powers in their fight against the Prussian armies, and it wasn't long before Japan had the third most significant naval force in the world. The largest was that of the British, followed by the Navy of the United States. Nevertheless, by the armistice of 1918, fears began to emerge of a new naval arms race, like the Anglo-German dreadnought race which had been instrumental in starting the First World War. Consequently, America, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, ensuring that the size of their ships and fleets were limited. Japan, already disgruntled with America's handling of the Portsmouth Treaty after the Russo-Japanese War at Port Arthur, were unhappy about the limits that had been set, and the rift between the United States and the Japanese Empire began to deepen. Matters worsened when the Wall Street crash of 1929 dealt a devastating blow to the Japanese economy. The Imperial Army, much bolder and aggressive than the Japanese Navy, pressed for an invasion of northeastern China, a region rich in resources. In 1931, the more nationalist factions of the military drove their troops into Manchuria, and before the government in Tokyo could put a halt on the action, the conflict with China was gaining momentum. While Chiang Kai-shek, China's military leader, battled against the Imperial Army of Japan, led by Hideki Tojo, the government of the United States was doing all they could to preserve a stable economy and ensure that they stayed out of foreign wars. America had been gravely affected by the Wall Street crash and was struggling in the depression that had hit its people so hard. There was, however, some improvement by the mid-30s, and with President Franklin D Roosevelt at the helm, America seemed to be well on the road to economic recovery, but there were now more pressing threats looming large. The fascist leader Mussolini, like the Japanese military, was looking to grasp new territory and had marched his troops into Africa, seizing Abyssinia, and soon after, in 1936, civil war broke out in Spain, and the country became embroiled in bloody battles. Haunted by the memory of thousands of lives lost in the First World War, America was reluctant to be dragged into another European conflict, and neutrality acts were passed to keep it isolated from struggles beyond its shores. Nevertheless, as the Japanese continued to march through China, America would find it increasingly difficult to keep its isolationist composure, looking on from the sidelines. By 1937, Japan had renounced the Washington Treaty, and the battle against China had escalated into a raging war. General Tojo had seized Shanghai and was driving his army south towards China's capital, Nanjing. There were many in the government who were appalled that the military seemed to be pushing forward on their own initiative, and before long, Tokyo would find itself at the heart of a diplomatic crisis. Eventually, Tojo's army reached Nanjing by December 1937 and proceeded to wreak havoc on the city and its inhabitants. Fleeing the horrors of Nanjing, the last of the Western civilians evacuated the city and boarded the USS gunboat Panay. The next day, to the horror of the ship's captain, Japanese naval planes began to dive towards the Panay, which was clearly marked as a US vessel, blasting it with bombs. The moment was immortalized by an American newsreel cameraman on board, and the ship sank slowly to the bottom of the Yangtze River. Although most were rescued, many people had been badly injured and 3 Americans had been killed. The newsreel of the attack was rushed to Washington to be screened by Roosevelt, and while the president deliberated on what action to take, back in the Far East, the American ambassador Joseph Grew feared the event would lead to war. This seemed ever more likely, as the extreme factions of Japan's military were determined to drive the United States out of Asia and were keen to encourage a conflict, but there were others who were mortified by the attack. Letters of apology began to flood in from Japanese civilians and even school children to the American ambassador in Tokyo. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto formally apologized to the United States. He was a Harvard man who had spent time as a naval attaché in America and was well aware of the extent of the country's considerable naval power. He had also bitterly opposed the invasion of Manchuria and the subsequent war in China, and his views were making him increasingly unpopular with Japanese pro-war militarists. As the Japanese government waited with bated breath for Roosevelt's response on Christmas Eve, the president finally accepted their apology. Ironically, 4 years later, it would be Yamamoto who would reluctantly lead his country into World War II, when he masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. While Japan continued ravaging China, bombing cities, and mercilessly killing civilians, Roosevelt became less convinced of America's isolationist stance. Americans were becoming increasingly disturbed by tales of atrocities in China, and 1 year after the Panay incident, America placed an embargo on the sale of aircraft to Japan and began building up its naval forces, as well as ensuring China was supplied with aid in the fight against the imperial armies. There was also growing concern over the persecution of Jews in Germany and Austria. By now, Adolf Hitler was becoming a prominent figure on the political battlefield as the German nation attempted to rebuild itself, and there were fears that another world war was on the horizon. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's Nazi army stormed across the border into Poland, devastating towns and cities with air and land attacks, advancing swiftly towards the capital, Warsaw. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany. The European conflict had begun, and for Roosevelt and the Americans, remaining neutral would prove ever more difficult as the war progressed. Japan, meanwhile, took advantage of the situation on the European continent. By 1940, Paris had fallen, and the pro-Nazi Vichy government had stepped into office, gaining control of France and French territory in Africa and the Pacific. Indochina, better known today as Vietnam, was providing a useful route for aid to China, and determined to block American supplies, Japan decided to make an agreement with French officials so troops could be moved in. On September 22nd, 1940, the Japanese and the French Vichy government, now controlling Indochina, signed an accord which granted transit rights through the country, although the number of troops allowed would be limited. But soon after the agreement was made, fighting broke out between Japanese and French troops. Within 4 days, ports and airfields were seized by Imperial soldiers, enabling them to have their warplanes stationed within range of American territory in the Philippines. Also, as the cities of the United Kingdom came under attack from German bombers in the Blitz, the Japanese looked towards the British Imperial outposts of Singapore and Hong Kong. But first, they demanded that Winston Churchill close the British-held route through Burma that was now the only way aid could reach China. With the battle for the Atlantic to consider as well, the British Prime Minister had no ships at his disposal to defend territories in the Pacific, so he had little choice but to give in to the demands of the Japanese, and the Burma Road was closed. By now increasingly concerned with Japanese hostility on a global scale, Roosevelt had moved the American fleet from its base in California to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, edging ever closer to the Japanese arena of conflict. To the servicemen stationed at the tropical paradise, however, it was a dream come true. With beaches, glorious weather, and any potential enemy over 3,000 miles away to the west, there was little thought of war. Despite the Americans' determination to stay out of the conflict, Roosevelt had by this time brought in the Selective Service Act, which required all males between 21 and 36 to register. Described as essential preparation in case the USA came under attack, Roosevelt was ever watchful of the Japanese, especially in the Pacific, and as events progressed, the American president's concern would prove to be more than justified. With their blockade on supplies to China now in place, Japan began to plan its next move. The Japanese Prime Minister Konoye had started to advocate the policy of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The islands of the South Pacific were rich in resources, so while Europe was concerned with battling against the Nazis, Japan could push the Western powers out of the Pacific to create their own Asian empire. America had been cutting back oil supplies to Japan since the summer, and the Dutch East Indies had crucial supplies. By September the 27th, there was another turn in the twisting world of international politics when the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka added his signature to the tripartite pact between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The two European dictators approved of Japan working towards an Asian empire, and as the three nations were united, the Japanese moved ever closer to a conflict with the United States and the Allied forces. Yamamoto, who was by now commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, made his opposition to such a pact clear. He was well aware of the immense naval power of the United States and felt that many took the prospect of a Japanese-American war far too lightly. His warning could not have been clearer. It is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. The question could not have been simpler. Was the Japanese government prepared to make the necessary sacrifices for such an extraordinary event to become a real possibility? It was a brave stance to take, and Yamamoto soon found himself the target for death threats, which came not only from extreme nationalists, but also from the Japanese army, and military police were even dispatched to follow his movements. Nevertheless, it was fast becoming increasingly clear that Japan was being propelled towards a conflict with America, and the army at least recognized how valuable Yamamoto would be in the event of them going to war. Despite his reluctance to fight a war with America, the admiral began working on the best strategy if a conflict was unavoidable. He realized, facing such a powerful enemy, the only hope Japan had was to attack America before her fleet headed towards the Western Pacific. Yamamoto now proposed a plan to attack Pearl Harbor in a surprise offensive to cripple the American naval force before they could advance west. The Japanese had been impressed by the success of the British attack on the Italian port of Taranto in November 1940. It was the first all-aircraft naval attack in history, and the admiral began to analyze the operation down to the minutest detail. He was an advocate of a carrier-based force and began developing torpedoes that would work well in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Few knew of the plans, as the element of surprise was crucial to its success. By now, the European war was spreading further throughout the continent as Germany invaded Russia, and British and Italian troops battled in North Africa. Roosevelt was keen to help Churchill and Stalin in the battle against Hitler, and while empathy towards China and the British war grew, the American public were becoming more enthusiastic about entering the conflict. In August 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met off Newfoundland to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific. The treaty they signed advocated freedom from want and fear and disarmament of aggressor nations. Coupled with America's embargo on oil supplies to Japan, the Atlantic Charter may as well have been a declaration of war. One Japanese newspaper described it as a blueprint of Anglo-American world domination. America's ultimatum was that Japan withdrew entirely from China and from Indochina and renounce its treaty with Germany and Italy. They were not terms that the Japanese were willing to accept, and having lost 75% of their oil supplies, the nation began to step up preparations for their attack. At an imperial conference in Tokyo on September 6, 1941, the Japanese Supreme Command decided that if negotiations bore no fruit by October, the empire would go to war. However, there were some in the Japanese government who were reluctant to go to war with America. The Prime Minister Konoye urged a meeting with President Roosevelt, offering to travel to Hawaii's capital at a moment's notice. But until Japan accepted the ultimatum set, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, concluded that there was little reason to meet. All attempts at diplomacy were in vain, and by October, Konoye's government fell, and the Army Minister Hideki Tojo now took position as Japan's leading politician. With the militarists now assuming total power, the last hope for a peaceful solution evaporated. The war-loving Tojo had little respect for the admiral who had opposed his action in China, but he recognized the value of Yamamoto in the war against America. At the beginning of November, Yamamoto assigned Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo as commander of the mission and set a date for the attack, December 7th in Hawaii. On November 17th, the admiral spoke to members of the 1st Air Fleet aboard the Agaki carrier. He prepared them for the American resistance he expected and then wished them success in the coming battle. Yamamoto would remain at his base in Hiroshima during the attack. Slowly, the ships which would compose the attack fleet began to disappear from Japan's home waters, heading for their rendezvous point in the freezing Kuril Islands to the north of Japan. From there, they would approach Hawaii. In the meantime, preparations were made to launch simultaneous invasions of the Philippines, Guam, and Malaya, from where the Japanese could attack Western colonies around the Pacific. American intelligence intercepted coded messages between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington, but assumed Japan's carriers had been towards Malaya, the Philippines, or Indonesia. They seemed to be unaware that there was also an enormous task force heading towards Hawaii. On November 20th, the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Admiral Nomura, presented Japan's ultimatum to America's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. It required the United States to resume supplying Japan with oil and to cease aid to China. As Hull began composing his reply, Tokyo cabled its ambassadors in America, warning that they only had until the end of November to reach an agreement. In the meantime, on November 25th, Yamamoto ordered the Pearl Harbor strike force to leave the Kuril Islands and head to the icy waters of the North Pacific en route to Hawaii. Just one day later, Cordell Hull handed his reply to the Japanese ambassadors. Japan must withdraw all forces from China and Indochina, and in return, Japanese funds would be unfrozen and trade would resume. As the fleet turned east and drove through the gales and fog of the high seas, the sailors and commanders at Pearl Harbor had no idea that an attack was imminent and went about their everyday business. The American Naval Base was known to be a prime target for attack, and every week the Navy had been practicing mock airstrikes in preparation. Far to the west, the Japanese fleet departed from the Kuril Islands. Nagumo had ordered any non-Japanese vessel that met the strike fleet was to be quickly destroyed before they could warn anyone of the attack. Meanwhile, on the coast of California in San Francisco, an intelligence officer picked up unusual transmissions emanating from the west of Hawaii. He assumed it was a Japanese fishing fleet, but U.S. intelligence continued to monitor its movements. The Dutch in Java in the Dutch East Indies had also picked up important transmissions, having cracked Japanese consular codes. The Japanese were informing the embassy in Bangkok of the wind signals. East wind, rain, meant war with the United States, and west wind clear would mean war with Britain, including attacks on Thailand, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Officials in Washington were notified. Meanwhile, American intelligence was aware that tensions were building. The German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had told the Japanese ambassador in Berlin that Germany would join the war immediately if Japan began a conflict with the United States. Soon after, Tokyo informed Germany that the time of this war may come quicker than anyone dreams. It was December 1st, and having seen the message, Roosevelt was aware that a peaceful conclusion to relations between Japan and America were looking slim. In Washington, American codebreakers discovered that Tokyo had ordered their diplomats in Washington, London, to burn their codes and consuls in Manila, Hong Kong, and Singapore to burn their codes. This not only meant that diplomatic relations had ended, but war was about to begin. But on December 5, 1941, a Russian ship, the Uritsky en route to Vladivostok, crossed the path of the Japanese fleet heading for Hawaii. All guns were trained on the transport ready to fire, but Nagumo ordered his officers to hold fire. Whether this was because Russia was keen for the United States to join the war and help in the fight against Germany, or because of Tokyo's wish to uphold their side of the non-aggression pact between the two countries, is still unclear. By Saturday, December 6th, British reconnaissance aircraft spotted a Japanese fleet off the coast of Thailand. The British commander of the Far East Fleet was in Manila with the American General MacArthur and immediately flew back to Singapore to rejoin his fleet. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, in Cairo, the senior United States Army observer was informed by the British that the United States would be attacked within 24 hours. In Hawaii, life went on as normal. People played golf and football, and that night in Pearl Harbor, sailors relaxed in the bars and clubs. There was a battle of the fleet's dance bands in one club. The musicians, which included those of the Pennsylvania and the Arizona, were relieved of their morning duties. All members of the Arizona band would die in their beds the next day. Meanwhile, a 13-part message from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington had been intercepted by American intelligence. Yamamoto had wished to abide by military law that there should be notice of an attack, and the Japanese ambassadors should take the message to the White House the next day. They were given 1 p.m. as the time of delivery. With the 5-hour time difference, this would mean 7 a.m. in Hawaii, giving 1 hour notice of the attack. Before the ambassadors had translated it themselves, that night Roosevelt read the papers and realized that Hull's offer had been rejected. "This means war," he said. The message was, however, incomplete, and it wasn't until the next day that the 14th part would arrive. At 4:50 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, Japanese submarines entered through the harbour gates. They were reported, and a hunt began, but a general alarm was not given. Less than an hour later, the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese began their war as they attacked British-owned territory of Malaya, but the authorities in Hawaii remained unaware of hostilities. The Japanese commanders had planned the two invasions to coincide at the same time, but an officer's error led to a slight change in plan. Meanwhile, General George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's military advisor based in Washington, had received the 14th part of the message saying that negotiations had ended. He sent word to Pearl Harbor to be on alert. Meanwhile, Ambassador Nomura called Hull at the White House to set up an appointment for 1 p.m. Soon after the attack on Malaya, radio transmissions between the carrier fleet and Tokyo ceased, and at 6:15 a.m. Admiral Nagumo gave the order to release the planes, and the first wave took off from their carriers in a giant swarm. On the main carrier waved the very same flag that had flown during the attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. At 7:02, a trainee at a Rapana radar station on the northern tip of the Hawaiian spotted a massive formation heading straight for them. The operator rang the fighter control center, but as a flight of B-17s was expected from the mainland, he was told to forget it. The morning sun was rising lazily over Hawaii as a gentle breeze wafted through the harbor and streets of Honolulu. Most were asleep after Saturday night out, but those who were up early and doing their morning chores would see the first wave of planes casting their shadows over Pearl Harbor. It was 7:55 a.m. when the first bomb struck. The first targets were the airfields. The planes didn't have a chance to get off the ground as the incendiary bombs fell swiftly on their targets. The Japanese had achieved their objective, the element of surprise, and were overjoyed at seeing the planes and ships all neatly lined up. One pilot exclaimed, "Haven't the Americans heard of Port Arthur?" As soldiers leapt into action on the airfields, the message, "Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill," was broadcast. More planes had now begun to attack the ships. The torpedoes, developed for shallow water, sliced through the water, hitting their targets with precision. Bombs screamed through the air, obliterating all in their path. Men aboard the battleships had little chance to defend themselves as they awoke to the terrifying sounds of explosions shattering the morning calm. Within minutes, battleships all around the harbor were ablaze, and the USS Arizona was engulfed in flames, taking with it over 1,000 sailors and Marines, including those of the band that had played in the Battle of the Bands the night before. Pearl Harbor was utterly unprepared for such an attack. Guns were unmanned, and those who rushed to the ammunition lockers found them locked. As a second wave of planes roared overhead, sailors seized what they could to fight back. Many began firing on the planes with machine guns and pistols in a desperate attempt to defend their fleet. The Japanese were astounded how unprepared the Americans were to such an attack, but as the second attack force approached, they would be impressed by the Americans' response as they began to man the guns. Many heroes would later emerge from the chaos at the harbor. One was Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia and the captain of the ship, Mervyn Bennion. Amidst the chaos of explosions, a bomb had exploded on the deck of the ship, hitting the captain with shrapnel. Doris was instructed to carry him to safety, but Bennion insisted on giving orders from the deck until his death. Despite having no training, Miller seized one of the anti-aircraft guns and began firing at Japanese planes until there was no ammunition left. Some Japanese planes were shot down as Marines and sailors fired at the swooping aircraft, but the losses of Nagamo's force were few compared to the devastating losses to the Americans. Meanwhile, further away, civilians who had at first thought the explosions were part of military maneuvers became quickly aware that it was not a practice. One reporter, waking to the sound of anti-aircraft fire, jumped onto the phone asking the press officer on the other end, "Who is it, Harry? You don't think it's the Germans?" As the battle continued at the naval base, many civilians were killed or wounded, hit by shells raining down from the harbor. While more ships were hit and the casualties rose, by 9 a.m. the Japanese envoys were walking up the steps of the White House. It was now 2 p.m. in the afternoon in Washington. Hull received Kurusu and Nomura coolly, but was unable to contain his fury for long. They were sent packing. They would later vow they did not know that Pearl Harbor was to be attacked. By 10 a.m., the skies over Pearl Harbor were clear, but the ground was a seething mass of smoke, burning ships, and people scurrying to and fro, tending to the injured. Over 2,400 Americans had been killed, 21 ships had been sunk, almost 200 aircraft had been destroyed, and 5 of Pearl Harbor's 8 battleships were sinking or heavily damaged. Only 29 Japanese planes had been lost, though many more had been damaged. However, the Japanese weren't finished. Vast oil reserves and fleet repair facilities hadn't been destroyed. Nagamo's junior officers urged a third wave to finish the job, but the admiral was reluctant to incur further losses to the fleet, and fearing they would run low on fuel, he turned the ships around and headed for home. Admiral Yamamoto would later acknowledge that the failure to order a third strike had grave consequences for the Japanese in the Pacific War, but for the time being, the whole of Japan joined in with the celebrations. In Tokyo, a news broadcast announced triumphantly the death-defying raid at Pearl Harbor. At the end of the broadcast, she announced "West Wind Clear." It was one of the signals indicating war with Britain. In the immediate aftermath, Roosevelt resolved only to declare war on Japan, while waiting to see if Hitler commenced hostilities before taking America to war with Germany as well. But while Honolulu was still reeling from the attack, 9 hours after the first strike, the Japanese began bombing the American base in the Philippines. General MacArthur, who was defending the US position there, had actually a much more sustained Japanese onslaught to resist than had been the case at Pearl Harbor. When Japan invaded the Philippines 3 days after the first bombing raids, they served notice that this was going to be a hard and bitter fought campaign. On December the 8th, 1941, as crowds of people gathered outside the White House, President Roosevelt made a brief address which would be broadcast throughout the world as the USA officially declared war on Japan. Shocked and angered by the loss of so many of their fellow countrymen, the American public cheered their president, now ready to join a war that after Pearl Harbor had become truly global. All that remained now was for America to await Adolf Hitler's response. The Führer was at his Wolf's Lair headquarters on the Eastern Front when the news of Pearl Harbor came through. The German armies were retreating from Moscow, and the war against Stalin and the Russians was not going well, with the Nazis sustaining horrendous casualties in a campaign their Führer had been convinced would be quickly won. However, Hitler was comforted by the Americans' declaration of war on Japan, and because he was so certain that his pact with the Japanese would now make him invincible, he made a bold announcement. "We can't lose the war now. We now have an ally which has never been conquered in 3,000 years. On December the 11th, Hitler spoke for 90 minutes, furiously insulting Roosevelt, giving a speech which he concluded by declaring war on the United States of America. It was a rash move, taking on the greatest financial power in the world, as well as the Russians and the British. For perhaps the first time, the people of Germany, who had, in the early years of the war, been prepared to follow wherever Hitler led, began to wonder whether their Führer would be able to deliver his promises of a 1,000-year Reich. As Winston Churchill rushed across the Atlantic to join Roosevelt in the preparations for what lay ahead, there were still questions being asked amongst the military. Why had the commanders at Pearl Harbor not been better prepared? The Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Husband E. Kimmel, along with the commander of the U.S. military in Hawaii, Walter Short, were demoted and found themselves blamed for what happened at Pearl Harbor. In their place, Admiral Chester Nimitz took over command and rewarded those who had fought so bravely at Pearl Harbor. Among them was Doris Miller, who was the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross, the third highest honor awarded by the U.S. Navy. Nimitz would play a crucial part in the war in the Pacific, and despite the fleet's terrible losses, it would soon be ready to storm into the islands of the Pacific and reclaim the land lost to the Japanese. But for now, Japan celebrated their triumph while the wrecks of the U.S. ships were hauled from the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. They had provoked the mighty American war machine to roar into action. While the Japanese battled against the troops of General MacArthur in the Philippines, the man responsible for planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, was far from optimistic, despite the undoubted success of the operation he had devised. Yamamoto was one of the few Japanese commanders who really understood the true power of the Americans, and although defeated on this occasion, he understood they would be back to fight another day, stronger and more determined than ever. As the conflict in the Pacific started to unfold, Yamamoto knew that the war Pearl Harbor had triggered was for the Japanese, already lost.